Welcome to Soft Spoken Mysteries. Tonight we're diving into one of 2024's most disturbing archaeological discoveries. A find so chilling that it made headlines around the world and left investigators with more questions than answers. Deep in the forests of northeastern Poland lies a complex of ruins that once housed the most powerful and evil men of the Third Reich. This was Hitler's Wolf's Lair, his Eastern Front military headquarters, a sprawling fortress of bunkers, barracks, and secret chambers where the fate of nations was decided. For 80 years, this place has been explored, excavated, and scrutinized by historians. But in February 2024, amateur archaeologists made a discovery that proved there were still secrets buried beneath those ruins. Dark secrets, horrifying secrets. They found 5 human skeletons, 3 adults, 1 teenager, 1 newborn baby, and every single one was missing their hands and feet. Tonight we explore what happened at the Wolf's Lair, the history of this fortress of evil, and the mystery of the mutilated bodies that still haunts Poland. This is a story about power, secrecy, war crimes, and the dark secrets that remain buried long after the guns fall silent. Let's begin. Part 1. The Fortress in the Forest. To understand the significance of this discovery, you first need to understand what the Wolf's Lair was. Not just a military headquarters, not just a bunker complex. This was something far more sinister. This was the nerve center of Nazi Germany's war of annihilation against the Soviet Union. This was where some of history's darkest decisions were made. Picture the Masurian region of northeastern Poland, or rather, what was once East Prussia before the borders were redrawn after World War II. Dense forests of pine and birch, lakes and marshland, remote, isolated, far from any major city. In 1940, this seemed like the perfect location for what the Nazis called Führerhauptquartier Wolfschanze, the Wolf's Lair. The location was chosen with meticulous care. Hitler wanted his Eastern Front headquarters far enough from the front lines to be safe from surprise attacks, but close enough to maintain direct control over operations. The forests provided natural camouflage. The remoteness ensured secrecy, and the thick woods would make aerial reconnaissance nearly impossible. Construction began in 1940, before Germany even invaded the Soviet Union. Thousands of workers, many of them forced labourers, toiled in these forests for months. They built not just a headquarters, but an entire hidden city. The scale of the project was staggering. At its completion, the Wolf's Lair sprawled across more than 600 acres. Nearly 200 separate structures dotted the landscape. There were massive reinforced concrete bunkers with walls up to 25 feet thick, barracks for troops and support staff, underground command centres, communications facilities, its own power plant, its own water supply. 2 airfields, a railway station connected directly to the main German rail network. The security was extraordinary. 3 separate security zones surrounded the complex, each with its own checkpoints and guard posts. Anti-aircraft batteries ringed the perimeter. Minefields extended for miles in every direction. Guard towers watched every approach. Attack dogs patrolled at night. Even the camouflage was sophisticated. Trees were left standing where possible. Fake trees were constructed over bunker roofs. Netting draped across structures. Paint matched the colours of the surrounding forest. From the air, the Wolf's Lair was nearly invisible. Reconnaissance flights passed overhead without detecting the massive complex hidden below. Inside this fortress lived the Nazi elite. At various times, nearly 2,000 people worked and lived at the Wolf's Lair. Officers, soldiers, support staff, secretaries, cooks, maintenance workers. And at the centre of it all, the top leadership of the Third Reich. Adolf Hitler himself spent over 800 days at the Wolf's Lair between 1941 and 1944. More than 2 years of his life, hidden away in these bunkers. He had his own compound within the complex, with multiple bunkers, a tea house, and living quarters. His daily routine rarely varied. Morning briefings, afternoon meetings, evening discussions that stretched into the early hours, all conducted in these underground rooms where sunlight barely reached. Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS and architect of the Holocaust, maintained quarters here. From the Wolf's Lair, he coordinated the systematic murder of millions. Orders went out from these rooms to death camps across occupied Europe. Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister, worked from offices in the complex. Martin Bormann, Hitler's private secretary and one of the most powerful men in Nazi Germany, had an entire underground bunker system of his own, complete with tunnels connecting to Hitler's quarters. And then there was Hermann Göring. Reichsmarshal Hermann Göring was, in many ways, the second most powerful man in Nazi Germany. Commander of the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, Minister of Aviation. Hitler's designated successor, a man who had been with Hitler since the early days of the Nazi Party. A World War I fighter ace who had become one of the primary architects of the Nazi state. Göring was also a man of enormous appetites. He collected art looted from across Europe. He lived in opulent estates while Germans starved. He was addicted to morphine. He was vain, brutal, and utterly ruthless. And at the Wolf's Lair, he had his own villa within the complex. It wasn't the largest structure. Göring spent much of his time at his estate outside Berlin or at his hunting lodge. But when he was at the Wolf's Lair, he stayed in a specially constructed villa that befitted his status as the second-ranked Nazi. The villa was built of wood and stone, more comfortable than the stark concrete bunkers. That housed most of the complex. It had multiple rooms, private quarters, meeting spaces, a bathroom, a small kitchen. It was, by the standards of a military headquarters, almost luxurious. But in 1945, as the Red Army closed in from the east, the villa would burn. The entire complex would be systematically destroyed by the retreating Germans. And beneath the ashes and rubble of Hermann Göring's villa, 5 bodies would remain hidden for nearly 80 years. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. First, let's talk about what happened at the Wolf's Lair, the decisions made here, the crimes planned in these rooms, because understanding the evil that occurred here helps us understand why the discovery of those 5 bodies is so significant. From the Wolf's Lair, Hitler directed Operation Barbarossa, the June 1941 invasion of the Soviet Union, the largest military operation in human history. Over 3 million German soldiers crossed the border, supported by tanks, aircraft, and artillery. The goal was not just military conquest, it was the complete destruction of the Soviet state and the enslavement or extermination of its population. The invasion was accompanied by systematic atrocities. Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing squads, followed the advancing army. Their mission was to murder Jews, communists, and anyone the Nazis deemed undesirable. In villages and towns across the Soviet Union, people were rounded up and shot. Mass graves filled with thousands of bodies, all coordinated from the Wolf's Lair. Hitler held daily military briefings in his bunker. Maps covered the walls, showing the advance of German forces. Coloured pins marked positions. Casualty figures were reported. Decisions about which armies would advance and which would hold were made in these rooms. Millions of lives hung on conversations that took place in underground concrete chambers. The Wolf's Lair also saw moments of high drama within the Nazi leadership. Relationships frayed, power struggles emerged. Göring, once Hitler's designated successor, gradually fell out of favour as the Luftwaffe failed to achieve air superiority. Himmler's power grew as the SS became increasingly central to the Nazi war machine. Bormann manoeuvred behind the scenes, controlling access to Hitler. And then on July 20th, 1944, the Wolf's Lair became the site of the most famous attempt on Hitler's life. Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg, a German army officer who had become convinced that Hitler was leading Germany to destruction, planted a bomb in a briefcase during a military briefing. The bomb exploded, killing 4 people and wounding many others. Hitler survived with minor injuries. The thick oak table that held the conference maps had shielded him from the worst of the blast. The failed assassination marked a turning point. Hitler's paranoia intensified. Thousands of people suspected of involvement in the plot were arrested. Many were tortured and executed. The security at the Wolf's Lair became even more oppressive. Trust evaporated. The Nazi leadership turned on itself even as their enemies closed in from all sides. By January 1945, the situation was desperate. The Red Army had driven German forces back across Eastern Europe. Soviet artillery could be heard in the distance. The Wolf's Lair, once a symbol of Nazi power, had become a trap. On January 20, 1945, Hitler left the Wolf's Lair for the last time. He travelled to Berlin, where he would spend his final months in the Führer bunker before committing suicide on April 30th. But before leaving, he gave orders for the complete destruction of the Wolf's Lair. German engineers spent days rigging the complex with explosives. Bunker after bunker was detonated. Massive concrete structures that had been designed to withstand Allied bombing were blown apart from within. The explosions echoed through the forest for weeks. Barracks were burned. Tunnels were collapsed. Anything that might be useful to the advancing Soviets was destroyed. But concrete is stubborn. Even with concentrated demolition efforts, the bunkers proved nearly impossible to completely eliminate. Today, massive ruins still stand throughout the complex. Twisted steel reinforcement bars protrude from shattered concrete. Walls several feet thick show the scars of explosive charges. Ceilings have collapsed into underground chambers. Nature has reclaimed much of the site, with trees growing through cracks and moss covering the ruins. But the bones of the Wolf's Lair remain. The Red Army captured what was left of the Wolf's Lair in late January 1945. They found a wasteland of rubble. Soviet forces occupied the area for several years after the war, using some of the remaining structures as a military base. Then, as borders were redrawn and the region became part of Poland, the ruins were largely abandoned. For decades, the Wolf's Lair sat silent in the forest, a monument to evil, a reminder of atrocity. Slowly, it began to attract visitors. Historians, curious tourists, people wanting to see where history's darkest chapter was planned and executed. By the 1990s, the site had become an official tourist attraction, with marked paths and information plaques explaining what each ruin had been. Today, over 200,000 people visit the Wolf's Lair every year. They walk through the shattered bunkers. They stand in the room where the assassination attempt occurred. They try to imagine what this place was like when it was operational, when evil men walked these paths and planned the deaths of millions. And for 30 years, one group has had special permission to do more than just visit. They've been allowed to excavate, to search, to try to uncover the secrets that still lie buried beneath the ruins. The WWII Foundation. Part 2. The Archaeologists. The WWII Foundation is based in Gdansk, Poland, on the Baltic coast. They're not professional archaeologists, though some members have training in history and archaeology. They're enthusiasts, people passionate about uncovering Poland's complex and often tragic past. People who believe that understanding history requires getting your hands dirty, literally. Poland's history in the 20th century was particularly brutal. Invaded by both Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. Occupied for 6 years during World War II, the site of death camps where millions were murdered. Then decades under communist control, a history of trauma layered upon trauma, and in many places that history remained buried, both figuratively and literally. The WWII Foundation specializes in what they call historical archaeology, using metal detectors, ground-penetrating radar, and old-fashioned digging. They search for artifacts from different periods of Polish history. World War II is a particular focus, given how much of that history still lies beneath the ground, undiscovered and undocumented. For over 30 years, they've worked at various sites across Poland. They've found weapons from battles, personal items from soldiers, evidence of atrocities, fragments of daily life. Each discovery adds to the historical record, helping to fill in gaps in the story of what happened. The Wolf's Lair has been one of their primary sites for years. Getting permission to excavate there wasn't easy. It's a protected historical site, and Polish authorities are understandably cautious about who they allow to dig. But the Lair Foundation has a reputation for careful, methodical work. They document everything they find. They work with historians and museums. They're not treasure hunters. They're trying to understand history. Over the years at the Wolf's Lair, they've made many discoveries: pieces of uniforms, buttons with Nazi insignia, ammunition casings by the thousands, fragments of pottery and glassware from the kitchens, personal items that soldiers left behind in the chaos of retreat, coins, watches, letters, all the detritus of a military base that was hastily abandoned and partially destroyed. They've mapped structures that are no longer visible on the surface. Ground-penetrating radar has revealed foundations and tunnels that were buried or collapsed. Slowly, over decades, they've pieced together a more complete picture of what the Wolf's Lair looked like at its peak. But nothing they'd found in 30 years prepared them for what they would discover in February 2024. The team had been working at the site of Hermann Göring's villa. The building itself was long gone, destroyed by fire in January 1945. Only the foundation remained, barely visible beneath decades of accumulated soil and leaf litter. But the team knew from historical records and old photographs roughly where the villa had stood. Their goal that day was to locate remnants of the wooden flooring that would have covered the lower level of the villa. Wood doesn't survive well in damp soil, but sometimes you can find traces. Discoloured soil, where wood has a more decomposed, nails or fasteners, carbon residue, anything that would help them understand the structure's layout. There were about a dozen people working that Saturday. It was cold, typical for February, in northeastern Poland. The ground was partially frozen, which made digging more difficult, but the team was experienced and patient. Archaeology is often tedious work. Hours of careful digging for small discoveries. One of the lead members of the team was Piotrek Banaskiewicz. He'd been with the Lair Foundation for years. He knew the Wolf's Lair site as well as anyone. He'd excavated dozens of locations around the complex, found countless artifacts. To him, this was just another day of methodical archaeological work. He was digging carefully with a small shovel, working about 10 centimeters below the surface, when he struck something that wasn't stone or concrete or wood. It was rounded, smooth in places, uneven in others. He brushed away the soil carefully. The object was off-white, stained with age and earth. It took him a moment to register what he was looking at: a human skull. Banaskiewicz stopped immediately. This changed everything. Human remains aren't treated like other archaeological finds. There are protocols, legal requirements. You don't just keep digging. You call the authorities. The team gathered around. There was shock, excitement, concern. Finding human remains at a World War II site isn't unprecedented. Many people died at the Wolf's Lair and in the surrounding area, both during its operation and during its capture by Soviet forces. Soldiers killed in combat, forced labourers who died from overwork, civilians caught in the crossfire. Bodies were buried hastily, sometimes in unmarked graves. But this felt different. This was right beneath where Göring's villa had stood, right in the heart of the complex, in one of the most secure areas that had ever existed in Nazi Germany. The team contacted local authorities immediately. Within hours, police from the nearby town of Kętrzyn arrived. A medical examiner was called, the site was secured, and the real excavation began. As they carefully expanded the dig area around the skull, the full scope of the discovery became clear. This wasn't a single body. There were multiple skeletons, all buried close together, all in a rough line, oriented in the same direction. By the end of that first day of expanded excavation, they had located 5 distinct skeletons, 3 adults. Based on bone size and development, all appeared to be full-grown individuals, probably middle-aged or older. 1 teenager. The skeleton was smaller, with bones that showed the person had been in adolescence at death, probably between 13 and 17 years old. 1 infant. A tiny skeleton, fragile bones barely larger than a hand. A newborn, or perhaps just a few months old. 5 people. A horrifying cross-section of ages, from the beginning of life to its middle, all buried in a shallow grave, beneath what had been Hermann Göring's bathroom. But it was the condition of the remains that truly shocked the investigators. Every single skeleton was incomplete in the exact same way. Every adult was missing both hands at the wrist. Every adult was missing both feet at the ankle. The teenager missing hands and feet. Even the infant, its tiny skeleton, missing the small bones of hands and feet. Deliberately removed, systematically mutilated, all in the same manner. This wasn't natural decay. This wasn't animal activity. This was something that had been done to these people, either before or after death. And that realization sent chills through everyone at the excavation site. Part 3. The investigation. Within days, the discovery at the Wolf's Lair had made international news. The story was too strange, too disturbing, too mysterious to remain local. News outlets around the world picked it up. Mutilated skeletons found at Hitler's headquarters. Nazi war crime discovered 80 years later. Mystery bodies beneath Göring's home. The story went viral on social media. Reddit threads discussing the case accumulated thousands of comments. Twitter was filled with speculation. True crime enthusiasts, history buffs, and conspiracy theorists all weighed in with their theories. The Wolf's Lair skeletons became one of the most discussed archaeological discoveries of 2024. But while the internet speculated, serious investigation was underway in Poland. Prosecutors in Kętrzyn opened a formal case. The question was simple but profound. Had a crime been committed, and if so, by whom? The first task was to determine the age of the remains. How long had these people been dead? Were these World War II victims, or might they be from a different era entirely? The Wolf's Lair was built in a region with a long history. These forests had seen conflict before the Nazis arrived. Could these be victims of World War I, or an even earlier tragedy? Initial visual examination suggested the remains were old, very old. The bones were weathered, stained by decades of contact with soil. Much of the soft tissue was gone. The skeletons were fragile, with some bones crumbling at the lightest touch. A forensic medical expert was brought in to conduct a thorough examination. Working under the supervision of the prosecutor's office, the expert carefully analysed each skeleton, looking for clues about age, cause of death, and the circumstances of burial. The expert confirmed that these were definitely human remains. That might sound obvious, but it's an important first step in any forensic investigation. 5 individuals, ages ranging from infant to adult. The bone development and wear patterns suggested the adults were probably between 30 and 60 years old at death. Dating the remains precisely would require radiocarbon testing, but the initial assessment placed them somewhere in the first half of the 20th century. The condition of the bones, the depth of burial, the state of decay, all pointed to remains that were at least several decades old, possibly 80 years or more, which meant they could very plausibly be from the World War II era, from the time when the Wolf's Lair was operational, or from the immediate post-war period. But here's where the investigation ran into serious problems. Determining cause of death from skeletal remains is extremely difficult, especially when those remains are decades old. Soft tissue, which often shows signs of trauma, is gone. Internal organs, which might reveal poisoning or disease, have long since decomposed. You're left with bones, and bones don't always tell the story of how someone died. The medical examiner looked for any obvious signs of trauma to the bones themselves: bullet holes in skulls, fractures that might indicate blunt force trauma, cut marks that might suggest stabbing or other sharp force injuries, signs that bones had been broken before death. Nothing. The bones showed normal wear and age-related changes, but no obvious signs of violent trauma. No bullets lodged in bone, no fracture patterns consistent with beating or crushing, no cut marks from blades. This didn't mean the people hadn't died violently. They could have been strangled, leaving no mark on bone. They could have been poisoned, which affects soft tissue, but not skeleton. They could have been shot in soft tissue areas where the bullets didn't strike bone. They could have been suffocated, drowned, or killed in any number of ways that leave no skeletal evidence. The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, but legally it creates a problem. Without being able to determine cause of death, how do you prove a crime was committed? Then there was the question of the missing hands and feet. This was the most disturbing aspect of the discovery, and potentially the best evidence of foul play. But even here, the forensic analysis was complicated. Some archaeologists initially suggested that perhaps the hands and feet had simply decomposed faster than the rest of the skeleton. The extremities, being smaller bones, might decay more quickly in certain soil conditions. But this theory had serious problems. All 5 skeletons were missing their hands and feet, all of them. The statistical probability of this happening naturally was essentially 0. If decay were the cause, you'd expect variation. Some skeletons might be missing one hand. Others might have feet intact but hands gone. The pattern would be random, but this wasn't random. Every single skeleton was incomplete in exactly the same way. Both hands at the wrists, both feet at the ankles. Moreover, the cut appeared clean. The bones showed separation at the joint, not the irregular wear of natural decay. Something had separated these extremities from the bodies. Something sharp, something deliberate. Had it been done before death? If so, these people would have bled out quickly without medical intervention. The amputation of hands and feet is traumatic. The pain would be excruciating. Death would likely follow within hours without treatment. This would make it a torture method, a way of killing that was both brutal and symbolic. Or had it been done after death? If so, the question becomes why? What purpose would mutilating corpses serve? Was it to prevent identification through fingerprints? Was it part of some ritual? Was it a message, a warning to others? Or was it simply the act of someone deeply disturbed, someone who wanted to dehumanize their victims even in death? The first skeleton that Banaskiewicz discovered, one of the adults, showed additional signs of suffering. The medical examiner noted severe deformities. The spine was highly curved, suggesting a congenital condition or a disease that had affected bone development. The skull was misshapen, lacking a clearly visible eye socket on one side. The jaw was displaced. The teeth were worn down to nubs, ground flat by decades of use, and possibly poor nutrition. This person had lived with significant physical challenges. They would have been in chronic pain. They likely had vision problems given the skull deformity. Movement would have been difficult with a curved spine. Their quality of life would have been poor by any standard. Why would someone with such obvious physical challenges end up buried beneath Hermann Göring's villa at the Wolf's Lair? Had they been a forced labourer, worked to death despite their disabilities? Had they been deemed undesirable under Nazi racial ideology and murdered? Or was their presence here unrelated to the Nazi occupation entirely? The investigation consumed weeks. Police interviewed anyone who might have information. Local elderly residents who remembered the war years, historians who had studied the Wolf's Lair, other members of the Lair Foundation who had worked at the site for years. Anyone who might have heard stories, rumours, or legends about bodies buried at the complex. Nothing useful emerged. The discovery was a complete surprise to everyone. No local legends spoke of a mass grave beneath Göring's villa. No historical documents mentioned executions at that specific location. No survivors' accounts included details that might explain these 5 bodies. The forensic team took samples for DNA analysis, hoping to identify the victims or at least determine if they were related to each other. Were these members of a single family? That would make some theories more plausible. A family of forced labourers, perhaps killed together, or a family who lived in the area before the Wolf's Lair was built, buried in what was later paved over. But DNA analysis of decades-old bones is challenging. The DNA degrades over time. Contamination from soil can interfere with results. The samples were sent to specialised laboratories, but the results would take months, possibly longer. Meanwhile, the prosecutor's office faced a decision: keep the case open indefinitely, waiting for results that might never come, or close the investigation based on the evidence at hand. On May 7, 2024, the prosecutor's office in Kärnten made an announcement. They were discontinuing the criminal investigation into the Wolf's Lair skeletons. Daniel Brodowski, the spokesman for the prosecutor's office, explained the decision to the press. The expert stated that the preserved bone remains were of human origin and came from at least 4 people, 3 of whom were most likely middle-aged men, with 1 child of undetermined gender, he said. Note that the official count said 4 people, not 5. This discrepancy itself is interesting. The archaeological team had clearly identified 5 skeletons, including the infant. Why did the official report only mention 4? Were the infant's remains too fragmentary to count separately? Or was this simply an error in the official statement? Brodowski continued, due to the advanced decay of the remains, it was no longer possible to determine the cause of death. There were no injuries that could indicate a criminal cause of death. At least several dozen years had passed. In other words, without clear evidence of how these people died, the prosecutor's office could not determine if a crime had been committed. And without evidence of a crime, there was no basis for continuing a criminal investigation. The case was officially closed. But for the later Bra Foundation, for historians, for the thousands of people around the world who had followed the story, the case was far from resolved. Closing an investigation doesn't answer questions. It simply acknowledges that the legal system can't provide answers. The mystery remained, and the theories began to multiply. Part 4. The theories. When a mystery this disturbing remains unsolved, theories inevitably emerge. Some are based on historical evidence and logical reasoning. Others are more speculative, and some veer into territory that's difficult to verify or disprove. Let's examine the main theories that have been proposed to explain the 5 mutilated skeletons beneath Göring's villa. Theory 1. Forced labourers killed by the Nazis. This is perhaps the most straightforward theory, and it has significant historical support. Thousands of forced labourers were brought to the Wolf's Lair during its construction and operation. Prisoners of war, people from occupied territories, Jews rounded up from ghettos. They worked in brutal conditions. Many died. The Nazi regime was utterly callous about the lives of forced labourers. If someone became too weak to work, they were often simply killed and disposed of. Bodies were buried hastily, sometimes in mass graves, sometimes in isolated locations. The goal was to hide the evidence of these crimes. Could these 5 people have been forced labourers who died during the construction or operation of the Wolf's Lair? Perhaps they were killed for some infraction. Perhaps they simply worked to death. And perhaps their bodies were buried beneath what would become Göring's villa. The mutilation might have been done to prevent identification. Without hands, fingerprints are impossible to obtain. Without feet, footprints can't be traced. In the Nazi mindset, erasing someone's identity was the final step in erasing their humanity. This theory explains the burial location. Forced labourers were everywhere at the complex. Bodies needed to be hidden. What better place than beneath a structure under construction? By the time Göring moved into the villa, the bodies would have been long buried and forgotten. But this theory has problems. Why include a newborn infant among forced labourers? Babies weren't brought to work camps. They weren't used for construction. If this was a family of forced labourers, why kill an infant? And why the careful burial? The bodies were placed in a line, all facing the same direction. This suggests some thought went into the burial, not a hasty disposal of inconvenient corpses. Theory 2. Soviet revenge killings after the war. When the Red Army captured the Wolf's Lair in January 1945, they were not gentle liberators. Soviet forces had seen the devastation the Germans had wrought on their homeland. Cities destroyed, millions killed. The desire for revenge was strong. There are documented cases of Soviet soldiers executing German civilians and POWs in the immediate aftermath of conquest. Summary executions, reprisal killings, acts of vengeance for years of Nazi atrocity. Could these 5 people have been Germans, either Nazi personnel or civilians, executed by Soviet soldiers shortly after the capture of the Wolf's Lair? Perhaps they were killed as revenge. Perhaps they were suspected of war crimes. Perhaps they were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. The mutilation might have been a way to send a message. This is what we do to Nazis, or it might have been done in anger, in the heat of violent retribution. Soviet soldiers had seen terrible things. Some responded with terrible acts of their own. This theory explains the time period. The remains appear to date from around the 1940s. The burial beneath Göring's villa, which had burned down in early 1945, would have been possible in the weeks or months after the Soviet capture. But again, there are problems. Why would Soviet soldiers take the time to carefully bury their victims in a line, all facing the same direction? Revenge killings are typically hasty. Bodies are left where they fall or thrown into mass graves. This burial shows care, even ritual. And again, why include an infant? What crime could a newborn have committed that would justify execution? Theory 3. Victims of post-war landmines. The area around the Wolf's Lair remained heavily mined for years after the war. The Germans had surrounded the complex with extensive minefields. After the Soviet capture and subsequent withdrawal, many of these mines remained active. For a decade or more, people in the area lived with the risk of accidental detonation. Local forest officials, including Zenon Piotrowicz, head of the Srokowo Forest District, suggested that these might have been victims of landmine accidents. People who died from explosive trauma in the years after the war. The mutilation could be explained by the violence of landmine explosions. Mines often destroy extremities. Hands and feet, being the most likely to trigger a mine, would be blown off. If multiple people were together when a mine detonated, all of them might sustain similar injuries. This theory has the advantage of explaining the time period and the location. It also provides a non-criminal explanation for the deaths, which would align with the prosecutor's decision to close the case. But the medical examiner's report undermines this theory. Landmine explosions leave distinctive fracture patterns in bone. Explosive trauma creates irregular, shattered bone structures. The examiner found no such evidence. The separation of hands and feet appeared clean, at joints, not the random destruction of explosions. Moreover, why would landmine victims be buried so carefully? Why in this specific location? Accident victims would more likely be buried near where they died, or in a proper cemetery. Theory 4. Pre-war burial later built over. This theory suggests that the bodies might predate the Wolf's Lair entirely. Perhaps these people died in the 1920s or 1930s before the Nazi complex was built. Perhaps they were buried in what was then simply forest, and their burial site was later unknowingly built over when the villa was constructed. This would explain why there's no record of their burial in Wolf's Lair documents. The burial happened before the complex existed. It would be coincidence that Göring's villa was later placed above their grave. But this theory struggles with the mutilation question. Why would people in the 1920s or 1930s be buried without hands and feet? What circumstances in rural East Prussia would lead to such mutilation? And if this was a legitimate burial, why so shallow and unmarked? Theory 5. Occult ritual. This is the most speculative and least substantiated theory, but it has been mentioned by researchers and has gained traction in some circles online. The Nazi leadership, particularly Heinrich Himmler, was deeply interested in occult practices. Himmler believed in mysticism, ancient Nordic religions, and various esoteric philosophies. He created entire SS units dedicated to archaeological expeditions seeking evidence of Aryan superiority. Could these 5 people have been victims of some kind of occult ritual? The removal of hands and feet has symbolic significance in various mystical traditions. Hands represent action, the ability to affect the world. Feet represent one's path, one's journey. Removing them could be seen as an attempt to bind someone spiritually, to prevent them from acting or moving on after death. The careful burial, the specific positioning of bodies, the inclusion of individuals of different ages, all of this could suggest ritualistic intent. And if anyone at the Wolf's Lair had the power and the twisted belief system to attempt such a thing, it would be the top Nazi leadership. But there's almost no concrete evidence for this theory. It relies on speculation about Nazi occult interests and the symbolic interpretation of the mutilation. Most serious historians dismiss it as conspiracy thinking. Dominik Markiewicz of the Lair Foundation was asked about this possibility. He was candid about the disturbing nature of the find. Were they victims of occult rituals by Nazi fanatics? We have no idea. You'd never expect such things in such a place, as it was the most guarded place in the Third Reich. Everyone wondered what might have happened there. We tried to think of something, but nothing reasonable comes to mind. Theory 6. A family tragedy. Some researchers, including members of the Lair Foundation, have suggested that these might have been a single family. 3 adults, perhaps parents and a grandparent, 1 teenager, 1 infant, a family unit that met tragedy together. The careful burial, with bodies placed in a line, all facing the same direction, suggests that whoever buried them cared about them. This wasn't a mass grave of victims treated as garbage. Someone took time to lay them out properly. Perhaps this was a German family living in the area before the war, killed in some early incident that went unrecorded. Perhaps it was a Polish family caught in the crossfire of occupation. Perhaps it was a family of forced labourers who died together and were buried by fellow prisoners who wanted to show respect despite the horror of the situation. The skeleton with the deformities, the eldest adult, might have been a grandparent, someone who had lived a long life despite physical challenges. In the context of a family, their presence makes more sense than in a labour camp. But this theory still doesn't explain the mutilation. Why would a family burial include the removal of everyone's hands and feet? What cultural or religious practice would call for such a thing? Or did the mutilation happen first, and the burial was an attempt to provide dignity to the victims after some terrible crime? As the theories multiply, one thing becomes clear. Without more evidence, we may never know the truth. Radiocarbon dating, when completed, might tell us more precisely when these people died. DNA analysis, if successful, might tell us if they were related, but unless documentary evidence emerges, records, letters, testimony, we're left with speculation. Part 5. The unanswered questions. Months after the case was officially closed, the mystery of the Wolf's Lair skeletons continues to haunt those who've studied it. The questions are profound, and they extend beyond just determining what happened to these 5 individuals. The first and most obvious question: who were they? What were their names? Where did they come from? Everyone has an identity, a story, people who loved them. These 5 people lived lives before they ended up in that shallow grave. They had hopes, fears, daily routines, relationships. All of that is lost to history unless we can identify them. The infant, in particular, represents a profound tragedy. A life that barely began. Someone's child, buried without ceremony, beneath a structure dedicated to evil. Did the parents die with the baby, or did someone else bury this child? What were the circumstances that led to such a young life ending in such a horrible place? The teenager raises similar questions. Young, on the cusp of adulthood, with a full life ahead. What happened? Were they caught up in the war? Were they targeted for some reason? Did they die alongside family members? And the adults, including the one with severe physical deformities. That person survived to middle age or older, despite conditions that would have made life difficult. They had resilience, or they had people who cared for them. How did their story end in that grave? The second question, how did they die? The medical examiner couldn't determine cause of death from the bones. But that doesn't mean there isn't an answer. Somewhere in the past, these people took their last breaths. The circumstances of those final moments matter, both for understanding history and for honouring their memory. Were they shot, strangled, poisoned? Did they die quickly or slowly? Did they know what was happening? Were they conscious? Did they have time to be afraid? These questions might seem morbid, but they're important. The manner of death tells us about the brutality or mercy of their killers, if they were killed. It tells us about the circumstances of that time and place. The third question, why were their hands and feet removed? This is perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the entire case. The mutilation is systematic, deliberate, consistent across all 5 bodies. It wasn't random violence, it had purpose. But what purpose? If it was to prevent identification, it suggests the killers feared the bodies would be discovered and identified. But why bury them so close to such an important structure? Why not dispose of them in a more remote location? If it was ritualistic, it suggests someone with a twisted belief system, someone who thought there was meaning or power in such mutilation. But who, at the wolf's lair, would have engaged in such practices? And why weren't there more victims? If it was symbolic, sending a message, then what was the message? And to whom? Who was supposed to discover these bodies and understand their meaning? The fourth question, when exactly did they die? The remains are several decades old, likely from the 1940s, but that's a decade-long window. 1940 to 1949 encompasses the construction of the wolf's lair, its entire operational period, its destruction, Soviet occupation, and the early post-war years. The specific timing matters enormously for understanding what happened. If they died in 1940 or 1941 during construction, the forced labourer theory becomes more plausible. If they died in 1944 or 1945 during the final desperate days of the Nazi regime or the immediate Soviet aftermath, different theories apply. If they died after 1945 in the post-war period, it suggests something entirely different. Radiocarbon dating could potentially narrow this window to a few years. But as of the latest reports, those results haven't been made public. Are they waiting for more analysis? Did the tests fail to provide clear results? Or is there some other reason for the delay? The fifth question, why were they buried specifically beneath Göring's villa? Of all the places at the Wolf's Lair, why there? The complex covered hundreds of acres. There were countless places to hide bodies. Why choose a location that would soon be beneath one of the most important structures in the complex? Was it because that location was being excavated anyway for construction, making it easy to hide bodies in the work? Was it deliberate, placing bodies beneath Göring's quarters as some kind of message or curse? Or was it complete coincidence, with the bodies predating the villa entirely? The sixth question, are there more? 5 bodies is a significant discovery, but the Wolf's Lair was huge. The excavation beneath Göring's villa covered only a small area. What else might be buried at the complex, still undiscovered after 80 years? The La Tebre Foundation has expressed interest in expanding their search. Ground-penetrating radar could potentially reveal other burial sites, but excavating the entire complex would take decades and enormous resources. And Polish authorities are understandably cautious about turning the Wolf's Lair into one massive archaeological dig. But if there were 5 bodies in one small area, might there be dozens more scattered throughout the site? Hundreds? The Wolf's Lair was a place where thousands of people lived and worked, many of them under duress. Deaths must have occurred regularly. Where are all those people buried? The 7th question. Why has no one come forward with information? The story made international news. Surely someone, somewhere, knows something. Maybe they've heard family stories about relatives who disappeared during the war. Maybe they've seen documents that mention deaths at the Wolf's Lair. Maybe they know of local legends or rumours that could provide clues. The Lair Foundation and Polish authorities have made public appeals for information. Zenon Piotrowicz specifically asked for anyone with knowledge to come forward. But so far, silence. Either no one knows anything, or those who know aren't willing to share. This silence itself is telling. It suggests these deaths were successfully hidden, even from those who might have been nearby, or it suggests that those who knew are long dead themselves, or it suggests that there are still reasons, 80 years later, why people don't want to talk about what happened. The 8th question. What does this discovery tell us about the Wolf's Lair and the Nazi regime more broadly? Every historical discovery adds to our understanding. These 5 bodies are a data point in the larger story of World War II atrocities. They remind us that the crimes of that era weren't just the well-documented mass murders at death camps. There were countless smaller tragedies, individual deaths, crimes that were hidden and have remained hidden. For every famous atrocity we know about, how many unknown horrors are still buried, literally and figuratively? They remind us that archaeology continues to uncover new evidence. We think we know what happened during World War II. We've studied it extensively. But 80 years later, we're still finding victims, still discovering crimes. History isn't closed. It continues to reveal itself. And they remind us that the Nazi regime operated with such secrecy and brutality that even in what should have been the most documented, most secure location in their empire, things happened that were never recorded. If 5 people could disappear and die beneath Hermann Göring's quarters without leaving a trace in historical records, what else happened that we don't know about? Part 6. The ongoing search for answers. As of late 2024, the Wolf's Lair skeletons remain officially an unsolved mystery. The criminal investigation is closed. No charges will be filed because there's no way to determine who might have been responsible. But the search for answers continues in other ways. The WWII Foundation has pledged to continue their investigation. They want radiocarbon dating completed on all 5 skeletons. They want DNA analysis, despite the challenges. They want to consult with more forensic anthropologists, historians and experts who might see something that was missed. They've also expressed interest in conducting additional excavations at other locations within the Wolf's Lair complex. If these 5 bodies were here, might there be others? Ground-penetrating radar surveys could potentially identify other burial sites without disturbing the ground. Then, if promising locations are found, careful excavation could be undertaken. The Foundation has also reached out to archives and historians around the world. Are there documents that might mention deaths at the Wolf's Lair around 1940-1945? Letters, diaries, official reports, even a passing reference could provide a crucial clue. They've encouraged anyone with family history connected to the Wolf's Lair to come forward. If someone had relatives who worked at the complex, either as Nazi personnel or as forced labourers, their family stories might contain relevant details. Even vague memories or fragmented stories could help piece together what happened. The Polish authorities, while closing the criminal investigation, have acknowledged the historical significance of the discovery. The remains have been treated with respect and are being preserved for potential future analysis. If new techniques emerge, or if new evidence comes to light, the investigation could potentially be reopened. Holocaust museums and World War II research institutions have also taken an interest. The Wolf's Lair discovery has been documented and added to their archives. It's part of the ongoing effort to comprehensively document Nazi crimes and World War II atrocities. Every victim matters. Every crime should be recorded. Some researchers are looking at patterns in other similar discoveries. Have other mutilated remains been found at Nazi sites? Are there documented cases of hands and feet being removed as a form of torture or punishment? Building a broader understanding of Nazi methods could potentially shed light on this specific case. There's also been discussion about memorial efforts. Should these 5 victims, whoever they were, be formally memorialized at the Wolf's Lair site? Many visitors have suggested that a plaque or monument would be appropriate, acknowledging their deaths and honoring their memory, even though we don't know their names. The Wolf's Lair itself has become, in recent years, more than just a tourist attraction. It's increasingly recognized as a memorial site, not just to document Nazi evil, but to honor all the victims of that era. The 5 skeletons have become part of that memorial story. They represent all the unknown victims, all the people who died in obscurity, all the crimes that were successfully hidden, but not entirely erased. Part 7. What we can learn. The mystery of the Wolf's Lair skeletons, frustrating as it is, teaches us several important lessons about history, archaeology, and the nature of evil. First, it reminds us that history is never fully known. We like to think we understand the past, especially recent past like World War II, that's been extensively studied. But 80 years later, we're still making discoveries, still finding evidence of crimes we didn't know about. History is not a closed book. It's an ongoing investigation. Every archaeological discovery has the potential to revise our understanding. These 5 bodies don't change the big picture of World War II or the Holocaust, but they add detail. They add nuance. They add complexity. They remind us that there's always more to learn. Second, it reminds us that evil often operates in secret. The Nazis documented many of their crimes, creating paper trails that historians have followed for decades. But many other crimes were never recorded, or the records were destroyed. The Wolf's Lair skeletons appear to be victims of something that was never officially documented. Their deaths were hidden, perhaps deliberately, perhaps simply forgotten in the chaos of war. This has implications for our understanding of history. How many other crimes remain hidden? How many victims remain unnamed? The historical record is incomplete, not because historians aren't thorough, but because those who commit crimes work to hide their actions. Third, it reminds us of the importance of archaeology and historical investigation. Without the Lair Foundation's patient work, these 5 people would still be buried and forgotten. Archaeology isn't just about finding ancient civilizations or treasure. It's about recovering lost stories, honoring forgotten victims, and ensuring that crimes don't remain hidden forever. The Lair Foundation works with limited resources, mostly volunteers, yet they've made a discovery of international significance. This shows the value of supporting historical archaeology, especially at sites of known atrocities. There's still so much to uncover. Fourth, it reminds us that victims are individuals. When we study World War II, the numbers are so vast they become abstract. 6 million Jews murdered in the Holocaust, 27 million Soviet citizens killed. The scale is incomprehensible, and it's easy for individual victims to disappear into statistics. But these 5 people weren't statistics, they were individuals. The infant who never got to grow up, the teenager whose life was cut short, the adult with physical deformities who survived against odds only to die in violence. Each had a unique story, even if we don't know what those stories were. Remembering this helps us maintain the humanity of historical study. Behind every number in a casualty report is a person. Every mass grave contains individuals. The Wolf's Lair skeletons, paradoxically, help us remember this by being unidentified. They could be anyone. They represent everyone. Fifth, it reminds us that justice is often impossible. The prosecutor closed the case because there was no way to determine if a crime was committed, let alone who committed it. Even if we knew it was murder, everyone involved is long dead. There can be no trial, no punishment, no legal accountability. This is the reality of historical crimes. The perpetrators die, evidence disappears. Time makes prosecution impossible. But that doesn't mean we stop seeking truth. Justice isn't just about punishment. It's also about acknowledgement, about recognition, about ensuring that victims aren't forgotten and crimes aren't erased. Sixth, it reminds us that some questions may never be answered. We want closure. We want to know what happened. We want names and dates and a clear narrative. But sometimes history doesn't give us that. Sometimes all we have is mystery. This is uncomfortable. It's frustrating. But it's also authentic. The past isn't a story with a clear beginning, middle, and end. It's messy, incomplete, full of gaps. Learning to sit with that uncertainty while still pursuing truth where possible is part of mature historical understanding. Finally, it reminds us why this work matters. It would be easy to say, they're dead. They've been dead for 80 years. It's too late to help them. But that's not the point. The point is to ensure their deaths aren't meaningless, to ensure they're not forgotten, to ensure that the crimes of the past are documented, acknowledged, and remembered, so we can better prevent such crimes in the future. The 5 skeletons beneath Göring's villa matter, not because we can bring them back, not because we can punish their killers, but because they're part of the historical record. They're evidence of a time when human life was treated with grotesque disregard. They're a reminder of what happens when evil goes unchecked. Conclusion. The mystery endures. So tonight, the mystery of the Wolf's Lair skeletons remains unsolved. 5 people, 3 adults, a teenager, and an infant died at some point around the 1940s. They were buried beneath what would become Hermann Göring's villa at Adolf Hitler's Eastern Front headquarters. All of them were mutilated, their hands and feet removed. And no one knows why. Was it a Nazi crime? A Soviet revenge killing? A tragic accident? A pre-war burial? An occult ritual? A family tragedy? We don't know. The evidence is insufficient. The passage of time has erased too much. The secrets remain buried, even though the bodies have been found. But the search continues. The Lair Foundation keeps working. Researchers keep analysing. Maybe someday, radiocarbon dating will narrow the time window. Maybe DNA analysis will reveal family relationships. Maybe someone will discover a document, a letter, a diary entry that provides the missing piece of the puzzle. Or maybe not. Maybe this mystery will endure as long as the Wolf's Lair ruins themselves endure. Maybe a century from now, people will still visit that site, still walk among the shattered bunkers, and still wonder about the 5 bodies that were found beneath Göring's quarters. What we know for certain is this: 5 people died. They were buried without ceremony in a shallow grave. They remained hidden for at least 80 years. They were mutilated in a systematic way that suggests purpose, even if we can't determine what that purpose was. And their discovery in 2024 shocked the world and sparked a conversation about what we still don't know about World War II and Nazi atrocities. If you're listening to this and you have any information, the Lair Foundation and Polish authorities encourage you to come forward. Even the smallest detail could be important. A family story, a fragment of memory, a piece of documentation, anything that might help identify these victims or explain what happened to them. The Wolf's Lair today is a place of both history and mystery. Tourists walk its paths. The ruins stand as reminders of evil. And now, They also stand as reminders that history continues to reveal itself, that victims continue to be found, and that some questions remain unanswered despite our best efforts. In the Masurian forest, the bunkers slowly crumble. Nature reclaims what humans built. But beneath the earth, beneath the concrete, beneath the layers of history, 5 people remain, still waiting for someone to tell their story, still waiting for justice, or at least for recognition, still waiting to be remembered, not as a mystery, but as individuals. Their hands and feet are gone, taken by someone for reasons we can't determine. But they lived, they breathed. They were human beings with stories and lives that mattered. And until we know who they were and what happened to them, the investigation continues. The mystery endures, and we continue to search for truth in the dark corners of history. Thank you for listening to this episode of Soft-Spoken Mysteries. If you found this investigation thought-provoking, please share it with others who appreciate thoughtful exploration of history's darkest secrets. Until next time, take care. Picture the Masurian forests of northeastern Poland, dense woods, remote, isolated. In 1941, this was the perfect location for Adolf Hitler to build his primary military headquarters for the Eastern Front. The complex was called Wolfschanze, the Wolf's Lair. It was enormous, over 600 acres of fortified structures hidden deep in the forest. Nearly 200 bunkers, 70 barracks, 2 airfields, a railway station. At its peak, 2,000 Nazis lived and worked within these walls. This wasn't just a military base, this was a city, a secret city, where the darkest plans of the Third Reich were conceived and executed. Hitler spent more than 800 days here between 1941 and 1944. From these bunkers, he directed Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. From these rooms, he made decisions that would kill millions. The Wolf's Lair was built for secrecy, built for security. The bunker walls were reinforced with steel and concrete, up to 25 feet thick. Anti-aircraft batteries ringed the perimeter. Minefields surrounded the complex. Even the trees were specially placed to hide structures from aerial reconnaissance, and within this fortress lived the most powerful Nazis. Heinrich Himmler had quarters here. Martin Bormann had an entire underground complex. Joseph Goebbels maintained offices, and Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe and Hitler's designated successor, had his own villa within the compound. It was beneath Göring's villa that the bodies were found. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. First, you need to understand what this place became. What's happened here? The Wolf's Lair witnessed some of the most pivotal moments of World War II. In July 1944, this was where Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg attempted to assassinate Hitler with a bomb hidden in a briefcase. The explosion killed 4 people. Hitler survived with minor injuries. The assassination attempt was the beginning of the end. By January 1945, with the Soviet Red Army advancing rapidly from the east, Hitler ordered the complex destroyed. The retreating. Germans spent weeks systematically demolishing everything. They used dynamite, explosives, anything they could to erase the Wolf's Lair from existence. But you can't erase everything. The bunkers were too strong. The foundations too deep. Today, massive concrete ruins still stand among the trees. Twisted rebar, shattered walls, collapsed ceilings. The ghosts of a regime that tried to destroy all evidence of what happened here. After the war, the area became part of Poland. The ruins were left to nature. Trees grew through cracks in the concrete. Moss covered the walls. For decades, the Wolf's Lair stood as a monument to evil and a reminder of history's darkest chapter. But it also became something else. A tourist attraction, a historical site. Over 200,000 people visit every year, walking through the ruins, imagining what this place was like when it housed the Nazi command structure. And for 30 years, one group had special permission to explore and excavate, the Laterbra Foundation. The Lair Foundation is based in Gdansk, Poland. They're amateur archaeologists, history enthusiasts, people passionate about uncovering Poland's complex and often tragic past. For 3 decades, they've worked at the Wolf's Lair, carefully documenting artifacts, mapping structures, piecing together the history of this place. They'd found many things over the years: pieces of crockery, rusted tools, ammunition casings, fragments of Nazi uniforms, personal items left behind in the chaos of retreat. These were important finds, helping historians understand daily life at the headquarters. But on February 24, 2024, they found something different, something that would change everything. The team was working at the site of Hermann Göring's former villa. The building itself had burned down in 1945, leaving only the foundation. They were excavating carefully, looking for the remnants of the wooden flooring that once covered the villa's lower level. One of the archaeologists, Piotrek Banaskiewicz, was working about 10 centimeters underground when his shovel struck something that wasn't wood or concrete. It was bone, a human skull, partially buried, stained with age and earth. The team stopped immediately. This wasn't an unusual artifact. This was a person, or what remained of a person. They called the local authorities. Polish police arrived. A medical examiner was summoned. And as they began to carefully excavate around the skull, the scale of the discovery became clear. There weren't just one set of remains. There were 5. The skeletons were arranged in a line, all facing the same direction, all buried in what appeared to be a former bathroom area of the villa, just beneath where Göring's wooden floor would have stood. 3 adults, 1 older child, probably a teenager, 1 infant, and every single skeleton was mutilated in the same horrifying way. All of them were missing their hands. All of them were missing their feet, not lost to decay, not scattered by animals, deliberately removed. The discovery sent shockwaves through Poland and beyond. Within days, the story had gone viral on social media. News outlets around the world picked it up. The mutilated skeletons found beneath a Nazi war criminal's home. The mystery that had waited 80 years to be discovered. But who were these people? How did they die? And why were they buried this way? The investigation began immediately. Polish prosecutors opened a case, trying to determine if a crime had been committed, and if so, by whom. The first question was age. How old were these remains? Radiocarbon dating would be necessary to determine the precise age, but initial examinations suggested they dated from the period around World War II, possibly the 1940s, possibly slightly earlier. The second question was cause of death, but here the investigators ran into a problem. The remains were in poor condition. Decades, possibly 80 years or more, buried in damp soil had taken their toll. The bones were fragile, weathered. Much of the soft tissue was gone. And critically, there were no obvious signs of trauma to the bones themselves that would indicate how these people died. No bullet holes in the skulls, no fractures suggesting blunt force trauma, no cut marks suggesting stabbing. Whatever killed them left no mark on the bones. The third question was the most disturbing. Why were the hands and feet missing? Some archaeologists initially suggested natural decay. Perhaps the extremities, being smaller bones, had simply decomposed faster than the rest of the body. But this theory didn't hold up. All 5 bodies were missing both hands and both feet, all of them. The statistical probability of this happening naturally was essentially 0. Others suggested animal activity, but again, the pattern was too consistent. Scavengers would have scattered the remains more randomly. They wouldn't have removed only the hands and feet from every single body. The only remaining explanation was the most horrifying. The hands and feet had been deliberately removed, either before death as a form of torture, or after death for reasons unknown. The team from the Lair Foundation was stunned. Dominik Markiewicz, one of the lead archaeologists, told reporters, "You'd never expect such things in such a place. This was the most guarded place in the Third Reich. Everyone wondered what might have happened there. We tried to think of something, but nothing reasonable comes to mind. Another team member noted the unusual burial. The bodies were positioned carefully, arranged in a line, all facing the same direction. This suggested ritualistic placement. Someone took time to bury these people in a specific way. But why? And who was doing the burying? The location added another layer of mystery. This wasn't some remote corner of the complex. This was Hermann Göring's villa. Göring was one of the most powerful men in Nazi Germany, commander of the Luftwaffe, Hitler's designated successor, a man responsible for countless war crimes. Did Göring know about these bodies? Was he responsible for their deaths? Or were they buried here after the war, after Göring had fled and the Soviets had taken control? The theories began to multiply. Theory 1. Nazi victims. Perhaps these were forced labourers who built the Wolf's Lair. Thousands of workers, many of them prisoners, were brought in to construct the massive complex. Conditions were brutal. Many died from overwork, malnutrition, or outright murder. Perhaps these 5 were killed and buried secretly to hide evidence of the atrocities. But this theory has problems. Why would labourers be buried beneath an active villa? Why would they be mutilated? And why include a newborn baby, who certainly wasn't a labourer? Theory 2. Soviet revenge. After the Red Army captured the Wolf's Lair in January 1945, Soviet troops occupied the site. Perhaps these were German civilians or Nazi personnel, who were executed by Soviet soldiers as revenge. The mutilation could have been a way to prevent identification. But again, questions arise. Why bury them so carefully? Why in this specific location? And would Soviet troops really take the time to mutilate bodies when they were focused on advancing further into Germany? Theory 3. Post-war landmine victims. The area around the Wolf's Lair remained heavily mined for years after the war. Local forest officials suggested that perhaps these were accidental victims of landmines killed in the decade after 1945. The mutilation could be explained by the explosive trauma. However, medical examiners found no evidence of explosive trauma on the remaining bones. Landmine explosions typically leave distinctive fracture patterns. These weren't present. Theory 4. Occult rituals. This is the most disturbing and least substantiated theory, but it has been suggested by some researchers. Certain elements of the Nazi leadership were interested in occult practices. Heinrich Himmler, in particular, was obsessed with mysticism and ancient rituals. Could these 5 people have been victims of some kind of ritualistic killing? Could the removal of hands and feet have symbolic significance in whatever twisted belief system led to their deaths? There's no concrete evidence for this theory, but the careful burial, the consistent mutilation, and the location all suggest something more than a simple execution. Theory 5. Pre-war burial. One possibility that has gained some traction is that these remains might predate the Nazi occupation entirely. The area had a complex history before the Wolf's Lair was built. Perhaps these were victims of some earlier tragedy, and the villa was simply built over an existing burial site. Radiocarbon dating would settle this question definitively. But as of the latest reports, those results have not been made public. The medical examiner's report added one more disturbing detail. The first skeleton that was discovered, the one Banaskiewicz initially found, showed signs of severe health issues. The spine was highly curved, suggesting a congenital deformity or disease. The skull was misshapen, lacking a visible eye socket on one side. The jaw was displaced. The teeth were worn down to nubs, indicating age and poor nutrition. This person had suffered. Physically, they had been in pain, probably for their entire life, and somehow they ended up buried beneath Hermann Göring's villa without their hands or feet. In May 2024, Polish prosecutors made an announcement. After weeks of investigation, they were closing the case. The reason? Insufficient evidence to determine if a crime had been committed. The medical examiner's final report concluded that while the remains were human, dating from several decades ago, the advanced decay made it impossible to determine cause of death. There were no injuries visible on the bones that would indicate foul play, and without knowing how they died, there was no basis for a criminal prosecution. Spokesman Daniel Brodowski told the press there were no injuries that could indicate a criminal cause of death. Due to the advanced decay of the remains, it was no longer possible to determine the cause of death. At least several dozen years had passed. The case was closed, but the mystery remained wide open. The Laterborough Foundation wasn't satisfied with this conclusion. Neither were local authorities. In the weeks following the prosecutor's decision, forest officials and foundation members made a public appeal. They wanted anyone with information about these remains to come forward. Zenon Piotrovich, head of the Srokovo Forest District, said, "We want to publicize the story in the hope that someone would come forward with information that could help us solve the mystery of where these remains come from. But so far, no one has. The skeletons remain unidentified. The cause of death remains unknown. The reason for the mutilation remains unexplained." Today, the Wolf's Lair continues to draw visitors. Tourists walk through the ruins, imagining the evil that was planned here. Guides tell stories of Hitler's daily routines, of the assassination attempt, of the final desperate days before the Soviets arrived. And now, they tell the story of the 5 bodies, the mutilated skeletons that lay hidden for 80 years beneath Hermann Göring's villa. Some visitors find the story fascinating, a mystery from history, an unsolved puzzle. Others find it deeply unsettling, a reminder that we still don't know everything that happened during those dark years, that there are still secrets buried beneath the earth, waiting to be discovered. The Laterborough Foundation has promised to continue investigating. They want radiocarbon dating done to establish the age of the remains definitively. They want further forensic analysis. They want answers. But even with modern science, some questions may never be answered. We may never know who these 5 people were. We may never know their names, where they came from, what their lives were like before they ended up in that shallow grave. We may never know exactly how they died, whether it was quick or slow, whether they knew what was happening, whether they died together or separately. And we may never know why someone removed their hands and feet, what that action meant, what purpose it served, what dark ritual or practical consideration led to such a horrifying mutilation. What we do know is this: 5 people, 3 adults, a teenager, and a newborn baby died at some point in the 1940s or earlier. They were buried with care beneath what would become one of the most heavily guarded locations in Nazi Germany. And someone took the time to remove their hands and feet before or after death. The Wolf's Lair was designed to keep secrets. The Nazis who built it wanted to hide their plans, their crimes, their evil from the world. They partially succeeded. When they abandoned the complex in 1945, they destroyed as much as they could. They blew up bunkers, they burned documents, they erased evidence, but they couldn't erase everything. The ruins remain. And now, we know that beneath those ruins, there are stories still waiting to be told, victims still waiting to be identified, crimes still waiting to be solved. The mutilated skeletons of the Wolf's Lair are a reminder that history's darkest chapters are never fully closed, that evil leaves traces that persist through decades, through generations, that sometimes the truth waits patiently in the dark earth until someone with a shovel and a sense of curiosity brings it back to light. 80 years after the end of World War II, we're still discovering what happened during those terrible years. We're still finding the victims, we're still uncovering the crimes. And in Poland's Masurian forest, 5 people are still waiting for someone to tell their story, to give them names, to explain why they ended up in a grave beneath the home of one of history's most notorious war criminals. Until then, the mystery endures. The questions remain unanswered, and the wolf's lair keeps its secrets. If you have any information about this discovery, the Laterborough Foundation and Polish authorities encourage you to come forward. Even the smallest detail could help solve this 80-year-old mystery. This has been Soft Spoken Mysteries. Take care.